guys, it's Ryan Dyer again. Most of you have probably bought a video from me previously. If you have not, then welcome. Pardon my annoying voice. I know it's hard to listen to sometimes. Hopefully it's not so annoying that you're not able to learn anything from this. This is another 10 tips video. Just cool little things, that I cover briefly. There's a lot of them. Things that maybe you haven't thought of before, different ways to use certain tools, different things to think about. And so these are cool little things that I've just picked up over the past decade of shooting and processing. So hopefully you enjoy the video, and let's jump into it. Okay, so this one will focus on keeping water and just the overall scene looking clean and fresh and lush. And I touched on this a little bit in my last 10 tips video. This one's going to take it just a step further, where in the last one I talked about keeping a nice cool white balance to your water. This one is going to take out a lot of the dirty browns out of your water that can kind of just keep things not looking super clean. So you can do this with either a single raw file and double process it, or you can do this with two separate files, which is what I'm going to do here. It's a little bit quicker that way. You don't have to keep jumping back and forth between raw files and blending them together that way. We can just work on both files right here at the same time. So I've got this first exposure here. This exposure is going to be used for pretty much all of the land areas. I've got all this land, and that's going to be kind of the base exposure that we use for most of the scene. The second exposure is going to be pretty much just for the water. I'm going to cool the white balance down like I kind of touched on in the last video, but I'm also going to take out a lot of the dirty brown, kind of orange and red colors that are here. There's a lot of these brown rocks underneath the water, dead foliage here and there throughout the scene, and some of these old dead logs. Those things just don't seem that appealing to me in a photo, having those kind of dead, dirty brown colors. So we're going to work on pulling those out. So I'm going to cool the white balance down, just like I did in the last video, and just having slightly cooler water. The tiniest bit of blue I'm talking about. That's going to keep water looking crisp and clean. But then we're also going to come in here to the HSL sliders. And I've talked about these a handful of times in other videos. Let's zoom in here. And I want to take, under the saturation, I'm going to take the reds and desaturate them quite a bit. Same with the oranges. And just right there, you can already see that a lot of the dirty color that's in there is starting to go away. You don't want to go too extreme with this, where these colors are totally desaturated, because then you just end up with these big patches of colorless areas. It just doesn't look right. So we're going to keep some color in there, but we definitely want it significantly desaturated. So that looks pretty good there. I might take a touch of the magentas out just because there's a few little areas of magenta. Something about like that. So that looks pretty good there. If you wanted to go a little bit further with it, then the exposure you're using for your water, you can, just pull a little bit of the saturation out of those exposures. And now that I've pulled out some of the vibrance and saturation, that nice blue color I had in my waters is going away. So I'm just going to throw a little bit more blue back into the white balance, just to keep that blue in there. Something about there. Let's bring back just a touch more saturation. So that looks pretty good to me. So now we'll take both of these exposures and open them up. So now with both exposures open, we are going to go ahead and make a selection of either layer, really. I work in this direction where I'm going to take my base exposure, make a selection of that, select all, and then copy, and then paste it on top of this one. As I've said before, one of my first steps in Photoshop is always to unlock the background layer. So I'll just double click that background layer, hit OK. You can label it if you want. I don't really label my layers. And then on this top layer, we are going to create a layer mask. And then with a soft edge black brush, we are going to blend in the lower saturated exposure into our base exposure. And I just do this by hand. I don't use selections for any of this. It can be, fairly easily done just by eyeballing it by hand. And we're just going to work this all in here. So trying not to go over into our greens too much, just because we have a different white balance. But if you happen to overlap a little bit, it's not the end of the world. You can't really notice that much of a difference. So I'll just work all the way around and through here. All of these oranges in there, and just kind of dead leaves, old logs. We're wanting to paint out a lot of that color. Some of these rocks here. I know this isn't the most interesting thing to watch me do, but the results pay off. So we're just going to work all the way through here. This log has some unappealing color in it, so we'll get rid of that. Up in here, there's these old dead ferns. The color of this log doesn't look that great, so we'll get rid of that. And if you're using a tablet, like I'm using, my Wacom tablet, you can feather the opacity. So you don't have to go as extreme in certain areas as others. You can just control your opacity by how hard you're pushing on the tablet. Get some of the blue back in this waterfall. And then there's some browns over here in these rocks that I don't find very appealing. So I'll get those pulling out. In this tree. And just a little bit out of this tree. Not much, just a little bit. And then let's go back and look. We can hit the slash, and that will pop up this this preview of what our mask is looking like. And then we go in and just fill in the spots. I normally start just by outlining the major areas, getting the edges done. Then I'll hit slash and go back and just get the rest of the areas. This is a good way to make sure you're not missing too many spots. All right, let's zoom back out and let's look at a before and after of that. So if I hold shift and click on my layer, it'll turn, or on my layer mask, it'll turn my layer mask off and on. So you can see that just kind of keeps things a little bit cooler, a little bit cleaner. You're not having so many browns that are distracting. Everything looks more lush. The water looks a little bit cleaner. So shooting twilight and nighttime stuff, it's something most of us like to do. Many people use it as kind of a fallback for if the light wasn't very good, the night you were shooting sunset. Oftentimes people stay later for the stars, and a lot of people don't even stay later for the stars. They shoot their twilight shot and add stars into it later. It's something that a lot of people are doing nowadays. Some people might find it morally kind of questionable, but if as long as the stars you're putting in are from around the same time of year, facing the same direction, I don't personally have a problem with it. So what I have here is this is a shot from twilight, about probably 10-15 minutes after sunset as it's starting to get dark, but bright enough to where I could still get a relatively short exposure, just so my flowers aren't blowing around in the wind too much. This was shot at ISO 2000 at a quarter of a second at f11. And so I've got this nice kind of land exposure here, but I want to make this photo look kind of dark and more nighttime-like. And then we can take stars from this exposure, which is facing pretty much the same direction at the same time of year. We can take just the stars from this exposure and drop them into this exposure. So what I want to do is I want to first kind of make this look more nighttime while still maintaining enough dynamic range to have it look pleasing to the eye, where we're not so dark that you can't really see anything throughout the frame. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to open up some of these shadows because these are getting pretty dark here in the bottom. I'll open these up just a little bit. Again, we still want to keep things dark. So as I'm opening this up, everything is looking very bright. So I'm also going to take the exposure down quite a bit, get it nice and dark and moody. Open up the shadows some more because now our foreground area is just getting too dark. So we want to find a nice balance between there. What I'm also going to do is I'm going to take a grad filter here. And I am going to drag a grad filter down. Let's drag it from right about here, just to start to darken up the top half up there in the sky. The nighttime sky needs to be a little bit darker. I'm going to remove my settings from earlier that I was using on a different shot. And so now I've got everything zeroed out and I can just fine tune it exactly how I want it. So I'm going to lower this exposure here, get things nice and dark in the sky, real moody. That looks pretty good to me. If the top of my mountain was getting too dark from that grad filter I pulled down, I could open up the shadows a touch. I don't really think we need to do that much here because that mountain looks alright to me. So that looks good there. I'm going to also go back and we'll just make a white balance adjustment just to get this a little bit more blue, a little bit more twilighty type of feel. Throw in just a touch more magenta just to get those blues really blue. But now that these blues are really blue, they're almost too heavy of a blue. I like to kind of have lower saturated blues throughout my scene. So I'm just going to pull the vibrance down just a little bit. Vibrance seems like it always targets blue specifically. The vibrance slider, again, I've covered this a few times. The vibrance slider is a slider that specifically targets the lesser saturated colors in an image. The saturation slider, that affects everything. So if there's a pixel with color in it, it's going to add saturation to it. The vibrance will only target the lesser saturated colors in your shot. But again, this vibrance slider tends to always focus on blues pretty heavily as well. It reads blues as being low in saturation. So if I know I want to reduce some of the blues, I can just take the vibrance slider, pull that down a little bit. That looks pretty good there. I might throw just a touch more magenta in there, and that's just personal preference. Something about like that. Now what I want to do is I want to try to match kind of the same white balance between these two. And there's no automated way to do that really. So we'll just eyeball it here. So on this exposure, I'm going to go a little bit more blue with it. And this doesn't have to be perfect. You just want kind of similar colors. A little bit more blue, a little bit more magenta. And I'm also going to back off the vibrance and the saturation. Because as I was adding quite a bit of blue into the white balance here, it's going to also start turning some of these stars pretty blue. We don't want really heavily saturated blue stars. So I'm going to go pretty light on the saturation here and back it off quite a bit. So that looks pretty good there. And now all we have to do is select both of these and we'll open these up. So now with both of these open, what I want to do, and this may be a little bit confusing at first if you haven't done this before, this was kind of a technique that I first read about from Floris van Bruegel. It's something that has been picked up and used a lot by many, many photographers, but credit has to go to Floris for this. And this isn't his exact approach, but this is kind of the way I do it. So I'm going to create two identical layers here. So I've double-clicked and unlocked my bottom layer. I'm just going to copy that layer. So I've got two identical copies. And then I'm going to come over here to my stars, and I'm going to make a selection. And I'm just going to use my rectangular marquee tool here. I'll just drag a selection of just the sky up there. I'm going to copy that, and I'm going to paste it onto this file. So now with those stars in place on top, I'm just going to lower the opacity and position these stars with the free transform just kind of in place where I want them to be. Something around there should work pretty good. Lowering the opacity while you do this allows you to see through your exposure for the stars and see where your mountain is back there. And so that just helps you place things a little bit. You've got a little bit more visuals to work with. I'll raise the opacity back up, and I'm going to sandwich this exposure for the stars in between my two base exposures. So now on this top layer, I want to take this top layer and change the blend mode right here to lighter color. All of a sudden you can see stars are starting to show through here. There's some other things starting to show through, but what we're really focusing on here is the stars that are showing through. Now it's not perfect. There are some little gaps here and there that are going to have to be cleaned up, and that's normal. You'll get stuff like this using this technique. But what I want to do is I want to try to minimize some of that's in there, and I also want to have a little bit more control over how many stars are showing through. So on top of this star exposure, we're going to create a levels or curves, if you prefer to use curves. I like to use levels. A levels adjustment layer. And now what's going on with this top layer set to lighter color blend mode is it's allowing anything that's brighter than this layer underneath it to show through. So the stars are showing through because they're brighter than the top layer. And so if we want more stars to show through, we can take our highlight slider and raise that up, and that's going to start to show through more stars because we're brightening, and so the more brighter things are showing through with that blend mode. We can also take our shadow slider down here and darken that up, and so now that these things are getting darker, they're not going to show through with that lighter color blend mode. So we can just balance these two out, have a few more stars show through. And this is really personal preference. Play with these sliders, play with the contrast adjustment to see how much you want to show through. Something like that will work pretty well for me. Darken this down, maybe darken down my midtones or brighten them, and just play around with the sliders just to get something we like. That's enough stars there for me. So I will collapse that. And now what I want to do with this whole scenario here is I want to go in and just double check that things are looking okay. So we've got our stars showing through. If things are looking a little bit too blue, sometimes the stars have chromatic aberration or weird colors to them, and that's just normal from some lenses. We could also come in here and create a hue saturation levels adjustment above the star exposure and lower the saturation. That's going to take out any odd colors or any fringing that's going on the stars. So our stars are going to get more and more white. Something like that. I'm still not quite happy with some of these stars. Let's pull back up our levels adjustment layer palette. Let's back off some of the stars just because there's some smaller ones showing through that don't really look all that great. Let's fine tune this. That looks pretty good there. So now I'm going to take all of these layers here and make a merge visible layer of them, right? And I've talked about that before. That's on a Mac, Shift Option Command E. On a PC, that is Shift Control Alt E, right? So now we have this fresh new layer right here with our stars put in them. We've still got a lot of stuff going on that we don't want. There's stars showing through the mountain. There's the city lights down here showing. So we're going to come back to our original layer down here. This one that doesn't have any of the stars. It doesn't have any adjustments made to it at all. We're going to put that on top, the very top of our stack. We can have our star, our layer with our stars added to it underneath. And now we simply mask in the stars that we want. So I've put a layer mask on the top there, and with a soft edge black brush, I will come in here and just paint in the stars that I want. So we can go all the way across here, and we're not going to want too many stars showing through our clouds. We don't want any stars showing through our mountain, and we also don't want a lot of stars down here on the horizon. You know, as things get closer to the horizon, you're looking through more atmosphere and more dirt and dust that's in the air, and so you won't get as clear a view of stars down on the horizon, especially at twilight. So we can back off that star a little bit right there. So as we're getting closer to the horizon, we're putting less and less stars in. Maybe back off these a little bit more. Put in a few more here and there. Something about like that. So there we have stars in our shot. We've put them just where we want them. You know, you can have fewer stars, you could have more stars. It's really personal preference on this, but this is a quick way of just adding stars to your twilight shots if you're not hanging out until 3 in the morning, you know, waiting for the darkest part of the sky to blend into your twilight shots, or just shooting traditional night photos. Okay, guys, so this one is about polarizers. I'm pretty sure 99% of the people watching this will have used a polarizer, has a polarizer, still uses a polarizer. If you're anything like me, I use a polarizer most of the time. And if you're anything like me, you get frustrated with your polarizer a lot of times. Polarizers can be great to cut reflections off of things. On wide angle shots, they can be a little less than perfect. You know, it's hard for a polarizer to polarize the entire scene, especially on a huge 14 millimeter shot like this is. You know, you'll notice, you know, everything's pretty nicely polarized throughout the scene. There's still little reflections down here on the leaves, on these ferns over here. Just kind of throughout the shot, there's some reflections that could be cut down. So what I have here is 2 exposures, each one turned to polarizer differently. Another thing I like to do, and this is something both Miles Morgan and I came up with a while ago, back in the day, using the different polarizer effects to your advantage to help in all sorts of different things. So in this shot, when Miles and I were standing here shooting this, we expected this waterfall to have a lot more flow than it did. It's been a really dry year this year in the Northwest, and the waterfalls have been just really low flowing most of the year. And so what our problem with this scene was this left side of the waterfall is nice and fairly full, and then this right side is a little bit lower than what we'd like. We would have liked to have a lot more water to balance it out. So what we ended up doing was deciding to use a polarizer blend, to where this shot with more of the reflections, if we blend this in to this shot with the less reflections, it'll actually mimic the look of more water, more brightness going on there. So it's not more water, but it can fill this right side in just a little bit more and make it look a little bit more balanced. So what we're going to do, just like with any other blend I do, I'll create a layer mask on this top layer, and I will come in here with a black soft edge brush. I'm just going to set the brush opacity to 100%, and let's blend in this separate exposure with the unpolarized right side. So I'm just going all around here, just in areas where I feel like it should, fill in just a little bit more. So let's look at that. Off and on. That just fills that right side in so much more and balances everything out. Another thing we can do while we're at it here is get rid of some of the reflection off of these ferns that the polarizer couldn't get to. So we'll just go over some of these reflections here. And I'm getting some of these messed up edges here on the top because I had to auto align these because I was standing in the water. And it's easy to get your tripod moved a centimeter when you're standing in the water. So we'll just pull the reflection off of some of these. That looks pretty good to me. Make sure we didn't miss any spots. So let's look at before and after there. So fills it in much more here. I mean, this waterfall feels a lot more balanced now. We also got rid of a lot of these reflections over here. Before and after. That looks pretty good to me. So this is just another way you can use your polarizer to your advantage. Not only removing reflections, but removing them from certain places and leaving them in certain places, and then blending the two together to get some cool results that help the scene along. So this is another thing I've touched on before. Warping is something I am admittedly fond of. Just to kind of tweak the perspective a little bit. Oftentimes, kind of going for the same results that people who shoot with tilt shift lenses go for. Sometimes a little bit more aggressively. One thing to remember is that it's something that some people forget is a lot of things can be done through selections. You don't have to just warp a shot by coming in and doing this big global warp where whatever you do down here can also have an effect on what goes on up here. Things can be done to specifically targeted areas. So what I like to do a lot of the times, if I'm going to warp a certain area and I want to make sure it's not going to affect anything else, let's just do this on a fresh layer so we can show you before and after. Say I wanted to get this line to come a little bit more of an arcing down towards the corner. Like I wanted a little bit more curve to it. I can make a selection around it, and I'm just using my rectangular marquee tool here. Make a selection around it. I'm going to go to free transform, then I'm going to go to warp, and I can take this and I can pull this down just so slightly, and this is going to just give me a little bit more of a curve to my line. So I can warp that independently, and that's only going to affect this. I can also warp, say I wanted to make, just as an example, I might not actually do this in this shot, but as an example, if I wanted to make this hill just stand up a little bit taller, and I do this a lot with mountains too, if I want to make the mountains just appear just a little bit more dominant in the scene. I can make a selection around this, go to transform, warp, and I can squeeze this little hill together, and that's just going to make it look a little bit pointier. I could push it up slightly, something like that. So what you want to remember when you're warping, though, is to pay attention to where you're pushing and pulling from. Warping can cause big issues with edges. For example, if I were to, let me turn this layer off, even right there you'll notice it. So in here, the warping has affected the edges a little bit, and that's just normal. That's part of it. It's something you want to try to avoid and try to hide. Having this layer on underneath it means those little gaps in between the warping are filled with pixels and color of very similar things around it. So right here on this edge, we've changed how things line up, but if we have this layer underneath it, it fills in those gaps. You can't see it. But you don't want to go too extreme with this. You want to keep in mind where you're pushing and pulling from. So if I were to make a selection up here. Let's say right in here. And I wanted to do something to this mountain, this little hill right here. Maybe make it taller, right? Squeeze it together some. If I pull from inside of this line, that's not going to affect my edges too much. So if I'm within this bounding box here, it's going to affect, all this edge, yes, but it's going to leave this edge intact. If I were to pull from the other side of this line over here, then all of a sudden I'm creating gaps there that I don't want. So you got to keep in mind where you're pushing and pulling from. If I want to, do something up here and not have it affect where this line is, if I want those edges to still meet, then I need to do it above this line. I can pull from up here just fine, and my bottom edge down there stays intact. If I were to pull from the other side of this line, pull up like that, then all of a sudden my edges aren't lining up anymore. So that's just something you really want to look out for when doing this. But if you pay attention to what's going on, you can get away with doing these little warps and just fine-tuning your composition, fine-tuning things within the scene. So I've said it before and I'll say it again. I absolutely love the new Camera Raw filter. It's new, just since the past year or so. But the Camera Raw filter is great. It allows you to just bring your shots back into Camera Raw. Use Camera Raw as sort of just a almost like a third-party plugin would be, like the Nik software, the On1 softwares. And so I love the interface of Adobe Camera Raw. But what I like to use a lot in Camera Raw, whether I'm editing my RAW files, whether I'm using Camera Raw as a filter, I love grad filters in Camera Raw. I use them so much for all sorts of different things. So I've got this shot. I've been working on it a little bit, and I want to use a grad filter to bring out quite a bit of drama in the sky that's just looking a little bit flat. So let's take a grad filter here, and let's just drag it down from, let's say, here to there. Okay, I'm just going to zero out all these settings. These are previous settings. It always saves your settings from before. So the way the grad filter works is you can drag in any direction you want, but where you click and start dragging is where you're telling the fade to start. And where you stop dragging and let go of clicking, where this red dot is, that tells it when the filter is done. So in this example, let's say I darken up the exposure a lot. So anything above this green line is going to be 100% affected. The fade or the graduation of the grad filter does not start until this green line, this green dot and line here, and it stops at this red line, or this red dot. So that's something to keep in mind of where you're clicking and dragging from, where you want this effect to take place. So let's zero this out again. So for example, in this shot, I might want to darken up some of that sky up there to give some drama. I also might want a lot of clarity. I love using clarity in skies. A combination of an Orton effect and some clarity can really make clouds just have quite a bit of texture, quite a bit of luminance. There's not a lot of luminance in the clouds in this, but let's throw a little bit of clarity in there just to pull out some texture. And clarity, all clarity is a contrast. There's all different types of contrasts, all the way from just a big global contrast adjustment, all the way down to sharpening. All sharpening is a contrast. It's just a very narrow threshold of where it's adding contrast. So a big contrast adjustment like this is looking for large groups of pixels to add contrast to. Sharpening looks for smaller amounts of pixels to add contrast to. Even down to 2 pixels next to each other will get contrast added to them. That's all sharpening is. Clarity is kind of somewhere in between. It's a micro contrast, but it's not quite so small that it's adding sharpening. But it works really well to pull textures out. So let's do that. Let's throw in just a little bit of contrast into the sky overall. Let's darken it down a little bit more. Maybe darken up our highlights a little bit. Open up our shadows so we're not getting too crazy dark over here. And then you could even come down, and if you wanted just noise reduction in your sky, you could reduce some noise in the sky. I don't need that. If you wanted to add sharpness to just a certain area, you could do that. You can add multiple grad filters at one time. So if I wanted to have another grad filter up here, I can do that. Again, it'll save your settings, so I always like to go in and just reset everything back to 0. If I wanted to darken this down a little bit, I could do that. Maybe open up the shadows and some of this frozen water here. Again, if I wanted to add clarity, I could do that. If I wanted to remove some clarity and reduce texture so it's not looking quite so busy in here, I could do that as well. Let's maybe darken it down, and let's have this effect start up here instead of down there. So you can always click on your points and change where this grad is taking effect. We could do something like that. Maybe if I wanted, just a certain part of the image to be, a little bit cooler, a little bit warmer, I could take this grad filter for the foreground. I could, cool the foreground up a little bit. I could take the grad filter for the sky. I could warm that up, maybe throw in a bit more magenta, something like that. Let's hit OK, let that load. And then you can see there how big of a difference we have just from one kind of major adjustment through a couple grad filters. So I've really used those a lot. I can't recommend playing with them enough. Just experiment, see how it can work into your workflow, and hopefully that'll help you. So here's another thing I really like to do in forest and waterfall scenes, especially maybe if you didn't catch the waterfall at the peak of spring shooting when everything's really lush, but even in situations in spring and summer when everything's really lush and vibrant and green, a lot of the times the color palette doesn't quite fit together. You get a lot of different shades ranging from orange to yellow to green. What I like to do is I like to keep all of the different foliage colors kind of looking similar. It gives the entire shot a more cohesive type of color palette. And I just use the HSL sliders in Camera Raw for that. Okay, so now that we have this in Adobe Camera Raw, what we want to do is we want to look at the two varying shades of kind of green and yellow that we have going on in this shot. With the two colors separated, kind of where you can see the green leaves and the more yellow colored moss, with those two colors so separated, it creates a very busy looking photo. Which is already a problem in a lot of forest and waterfall scenes like this, is they're very busy. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of textures. So anything we can do to try to tame a lot of the busyness in a shot like this will be to our benefit. So what I want to do is come in here into the HSL sliders. And I've talked about these before. These allow you to control the hue, the saturation, and the luminance, or the brightness of any given color in your photo. So under hue, I want to take the yellows and I want to nudge those more towards green. So we'll put those more towards green, and the greens I want to nudge more towards yellow. And I want to try to get these two colors to be a little bit closer together. So you can already see that our greens and our yellows and our moss are starting to come together to be a very similar color. That's really what we're after here. Something about like that. Also, like I've said before, I like to take a lot of the color out of dead foliage in a shot. There's a lot of that over here. And that's just taking saturation out of the oranges and the reds normally. So I'll pull some saturation out of those. And then maybe I'll add some saturation just into the yellows and the greens, just to make those pop a little bit more. Something about like that. Now okay, so now that we have this back in Photoshop with that adjustment made, I'll turn off this layer and show you the before and after. So before we had this scene without the color adjustments, and everything just kind of looks busy and uncohesive. Let me turn this layer back on. And there you can see all the greens are starting to become a very similar green. They look like they belong together. So this is just a way to keep colors kind of cohesive, keep a decent color palette throughout the entire scene, and really make things look less busy in an already busy scene. So this section is going to cover difficult exposure blends. Despite modern advances in digital sensors, having more dynamic range, just better capabilities overall, there still are times when exposure blending is necessary. There's also times when you may not be shooting with the most modern gear. Up until last year, I was shooting with a Canon 5D Mark II. So, either way, depending on if you've got an older camera, a newer camera, sometimes there are difficult exposure blends that need to be done. In this example, what I have is a bright exposure, exposed for all the land in this tree, and then a darker exposure, exposed just for the sky. Now, to blend these two together by hand would be next to impossible, and I can say that because I tried to do that back before luminosity masks were really popular, when they're just kind of first coming out. That's what I tried to do with this shot. It just masking this together by hand, with the tiniest of brushes coming in here into every single little tree limb. I spent about 4 hours on it, and it looked like garbage when I was done with it. It wasn't until I got proficient with luminosity masking and understanding all the possibilities that luminosity masks open up for you. So what we're going to do is we're going to get these exposures blended together, and it's going to look seamless even around this very complicated and detailed tree. So like I said, I've got my bright exposure for all the land areas. I've got my darker exposure for the sky, and we're going to get these two put together. So the way I start with this is the way I start with any other type of exposure blend. I'm just going to create a layer mask there, and with a black brush, with a soft edge, I'm going to come in here and just start blending this in, just by hand. Now I've got my opacity on my brush set to 100%, but like I always state, I use a Wacom tablet to do, everything pretty much in Photoshop. So I'm able to control the opacity of my brush with how hard I'm pushing with the Wacom tablet. So we're just going to get this in here fairly roughly. We've gone over a tree. That's no big deal. And we'll go over the edge of our mountains just a little bit. That's not a big deal either, because we will be fixing those areas. So when you go with a larger brush, you can feather things out just a little bit more. So I'll just slowly feather those in there. And I'm barely pushing with my tablet here. So just lightly working those in there. I'm just trying to feather this just a little bit more. Something about like that. So now what we want to do, now that we've got the rough blend put in there, we're going to create a new merge visible layer. To do that on a Mac, it's a combination of Shift, Option, Command, E. On a PC, that is Shift, Control, Alt, E. And so now we've got this new stamped layer of what we just did. Now what I want to do, let's turn this off for a second. I want to take this top layer, this bright exposure layer here. I want to remove the mask that I just put on it. So I'm just going to right click and delete layer mask. And so now I have my original bright exposure. And this original bright exposure is what we're going to use to put the tree in and the tops of the mountains that they got super dark. So let's turn this top layer back on, and then let's go in and create all of our darks masks in the channels. So we'll just click that. And if you're unfamiliar with luminosity masks, I always recommend going to Tony Kuiper's website. Tony Kuiper is the developer of luminosity masks. His site is goodlight.us. And also, if you're looking for more instruction and information about how to use luminosity masks and an overall way to learn them, I always recommend Sean Bagshaw's instructional video, which you can also get at goodlight.us. So check those out if you haven't. So now I want to come in here and I want to find a selection that does a good job of selecting just the tree. and not any of the background behind it. So we're going to go through here and look for something where the tree is mostly selected. Something where we've got nice whites around our tree and blacks in the background, because the way this selection works is whatever's whitest is most selected and whatever's blackest is least selected. So let's look here. So this does a good job of knocking out pretty much all of the sky, but our tree is starting to become less selected than what we'd like. So I think we'll take this one, and to load this selection, we're going to just drag and drop it to this little icon right down here, and that loads the selection. Now let's click on RGB so we can view our colors again. Go back to our layers. And on this top layer here, we're going to want to create a layer mask and have this mask out all the darks for us. But right now, if we were to create our layer mask, it would do the opposite of what we wanted. So we want to come up here to select, go to inverse, and now we can create our layer mask. And so you can see this has masked out all of those darks like we liked. But it's also done it in areas where we might not have wanted it to do. It's masked out some of the shadowy areas in the sky, some of the land here. If I click this mask off and on, you can see it's not gotten everything perfect. Especially up here in the sky. We still want to maintain some of the contrast up there. And with this mask, we're losing it. But we did get our tree blended in there very well, and the tops of our mountains. So what I want to do at this point is create another merge visible layer. Again, that's Shift Option Command E on a Mac, Shift Alt Control E on a PC. And just like we did before, I want to remove this layer mask on the layer below. Okay, and then we've got our new version with the darks masked in there, our original version with our hand blended exposures, and we want to switch these two in their order. So I've got our original version with kind of the less than stellar blend job around the edges on top. Underneath, we've got our new one that has the nice blended edges, but is losing some of the contrast in the sky. Let's put a layer mask on the top, and then blend in just the areas we want, which will be just around this tree. And some of the top edges around here of the hills and the mountains. Get rid of that. Let's look at that before and after. So that gives us our nice perfect blend. If you look around here at the tree, everything's blended seamlessly. There's no halos, there's no overlapping of dark and bright. So if I zoom out here, let's look at a before and after of all of this. So I'll just create a new merge visible layer as our after, and then we can look at our before. So before we had this, or we even had this, and this is what we have after. A perfectly blended, seamless blend around all of our hard edges here. A blend like this would not really be possible without use of some sort of luminosity selection like this. So this is just a little intro as to how you can manage some of these difficult blends. So flare can be one of the bigger pains in the butt you'll have to deal with in processing. The shooting into the sun, even if the sun's just outside of the frame, you can get all sorts of weird colors and blotches and all sorts of stuff going on, especially if you have a dirty lens. That'll help show flare quite a bit more. Normally, it's not too much of a problem to go in with the clone tool. The spot healing tool will just kind of fix things here and there. But when you start working with fixing flare right around a sunstar, especially in a scene like this where we've got these these sea stacks with the sunstar coming right through them, to get in and clone a lot of this stuff would be really, really hard, really time consuming. especially considering there's not a lot of areas to source from for your cloning. So what I like to do sometimes is take an extremely different approach and fix the colors and brightness values by hand. And so what we will need to do here, let's create two identical layers. So let me turn off all my bottom layers down here. So with that layer selected, I'm just going to make a copy of it. So now we've got two identical layers, right? Simple enough. Let's turn this top layer off and click on this lower layer. In between these two identical layers, I want to create a hue saturation adjustment layer, and I'm also going to create a levels adjustment layer. So I've got those two adjustment layers right in there. We haven't done anything to them yet. Let's turn our top layer back on. On our top layer, let's create a layer mask right there. And let's take a black brush and let's mask out some of the areas that we plan on fixing the flare. So let's say right in here, let's try to fix some of this, especially this band of red right here. So let's mask this out, and if you want to be able to see what you're doing better, then hit the slash on your keyboard. So let's mask some of this out. And we're just trying to eyeball this here. We're trying to get it close but not perfect. We're just trying to set a point to where we can start seeing through and see what we're doing to our adjustments underneath. Hit the slash again, take away that preview. And so now we need to mess with the color and the brightness value of what we just masked out. Okay, so let's go into the brightness, which would be our levels adjustment. Double click that. Now this is significantly brighter in through here than it needs to be. We've got this big flare right there, and we need it to look more like this over here. So what I can do is I can just start darkening up some of that flare, and we're focusing on just that one band of red we had going on. Let's go a little bit dark like that, you know, trying to get it to look like what would be over here. That might be a touch too dark. Let's brighten it back up. See, about there. Now let's go into our hue saturation adjustment layer we made. Let's double click that. Now it's a little bit more red and a little bit more saturated than, you know, what should be there. You know, and we're judging what should be there based on what would be like right here, because those are very similar areas. So let's take the saturation out of that area some. You don't want to go too much. And let's change the hue to be a little less red. And let's go a little bit more kind of yellow with it, like that. Pull out a little bit more saturation. You know, something about there. So now let's go back and let's disable our mask and see what it looked like before. So that's what it was like before. You know, bright and red. Let's pull it out. Let's darken it up some. And then, you know, we have all these other areas that would need to be fixed. But that just, you know, that's a way to get it started, get it looking decent there. And you need to do the same for all of the other areas. So if it's an area where you're having trouble cloning it in, there's other ways to fix it besides cloning or spot healing. So experiment with it. It's just, you know, a little something I wanted to throw in as extra. You know, just something to play with and think about next time you find yourself in a really difficult flare situation. All right, so this is another thing I like to do to water. I kind of just call this water glow. It's not so much of a glow as like an Orton effect or a glamour glow, things like that. I just do this with dodging and burning, and it's a way to make water have a little bit more highlights, a little bit more character, looks a little bit fuller. I'm not talking about like in my last video where I really filled in water spray and made it look like there was a lot more water than there actually was. This is just adding highlights and really making it look like where water is splashing, it is splashing a little bit more. It's just getting a little bit brighter in those areas. So what I like to do is I'll come in here and I'll create a dodge burn layer. I've talked about how to create dodge burn layers in some of my other videos. I just have it set up as an action right there. So now on my dodge burn layer, I'm going to hit my foreground color, and I just want to sample a color anywhere from, kind of in the water highlights. Let's find something about there. I've got a little bit of blue in my water that I like. And so I'm going to sample some of that blue. Let's make a really bright version of it. Maybe throw in a touch more saturation. Something about there. And so now at a fairly high opacity, I'll do this at around 50% opacity in my brush, but I also further control the opacity of my brush with my Wacom tablet. Now I'll just come in, and anywhere where there is water splashing on the rocks in here, I'm going to just come in and highlight these a little bit. And it doesn't have to be really precise. You're not going for a real small brush here, because the goal is to kind of make these glow. And to make them glow, you want to have it be a little bit larger than what is naturally there. So we'll come in and add some highlights there, a little bit up here. We can change the brush size, and I just use the brackets on my keyboard to change brush size. So anywhere where this water is hitting the rocks, that's where I'm trying to make this glow. A little bit in here. Some there and there. And you're going to want to look for the natural highlights. And we're just accentuating those natural highlights. Just making them a little bit more bold. They stand out just a touch more. Now, so if we zoom out and take a look at this, you can see how all those stand out. And there's just a touch more action going on in there. If you feel like you went too strong with it, you can just take the opacity of your layer and drop the opacity down to whatever you like. Maybe I went a little bit too strong with mine. So let's say I kind of like how that looks there. You don't want to go too overboard, because then you start to lose any sort of realism to your photo. But that about there looks pretty good. So again, this isn't a new technique for you guys, but it's a new thing to do with existing knowledge. If you've seen a lot of my videos, then you already know how to dodge and burn. But this is just a new thing to think about when you're dodging and burning, and a new thing to use dodging and burning on. So chances are you've been in the situation where you go out shooting, the light's looking good to your eye, it looks good on the back of your camera maybe, you like everything that's going on. You get home and you realize there's just not as much color as you thought there'd be in the sky, or the color of the light. It's just fallen a little bit flat. And then you sit there, if you're anything like me, you crank up the vibrance and saturation, and fiddle with the white balance for longer than you should. You go into the HSL sliders and you're trying to boost things up, and it just still doesn't quite look right. Well, here is another option to try to pull out colors from something that may have fallen flat in your raw files. So what I want to do, and I've just got two exposures here, just so we could look at a before and after as I do this. So what I want to do is crank up the vibrance and saturation a bit. Just pull out as much color as we can there. We don't want to go too extreme, because oversaturated is never good. So now we want to go in here into the camera calibration sliders. These allow you to just make big global adjustments to the hues of the image. So what I want to do here is I want to take the red primary hue slider. Let's crank that all the way to the left, just minus 100. Let's take the saturation and go to plus 100. Let's do the same thing with the greens. Let's take the green hue and put that at minus 100, saturation at plus 100. The blues, let's take the blues down just a little bit. Let's take it down maybe minus, 12, 13, 14, 15, around there. And then let's take the saturation and let's give it just a little bump in saturation here. See, something like that. That's coming across a little bit green. So let's take the shadows slider here. And let's put the tint a little bit cooler, a little bit more towards magenta to get rid of some of that green color we had going on. And I'm just slowly working it over just so we can see it as it happens. So something about there looks pretty good to me. We've really started to pull a lot of kind of nice cool colors, but still maintaining warm colors in the sky. And then if you wanted to, you could go in and just further dial in the colors. If I wanted a little bit more magenta overall, I could just take the white balance, take the tint and slide that a little bit more towards magenta. If you wanted to go cooler or warmer with the white balance, you could go warmer, you could go a little bit cooler. I'd probably prefer it somewhere right around there. And so now you've been able to pull out, some decent sunset type of colors without having to work the vibrance and saturation too hard. You haven't had to work the HSL sliders really hard. Going overboard with the HSL adjustments can really start to give you some bad color separations where colors no longer, blend together seamlessly. They start to get separated and blotchy. So let's look at a before and after. So this is before here. And this is just very flat, kind of not a lot going on. And when I was sitting there shooting this in Norway, the light felt warmer, it felt more dramatic, it felt more colorful. Then when I got home, the raw files were just flat. So here's after, and this is just a few minutes worth of work. Let's let that load. There it goes. So that's a way to try to extract as much color out of your flat files as you can. So play around with that. Just experiment with it and see what works best for your shots.